In the frozen winter of 1943, deep in the occupied forests of southern Poland, a 10-year-old girl named Marta Kowalski discovered that the most effective weapon against the Third Reich's most feared hunters wasn't a gun, a knife, or even courage. It was something her grandmother kept in a clay pot in the kitchen: garlic. While Nazi officers trained their German shepherds for months to track the scent of fear, sweat, and desperation through snow and mud, this child figured out how to make those animals completely useless, with nothing more than crushed cloves and the kind of clarity that only comes when death is sniffing at your door. The SS had perfected the art of the hunt, turning the Polish countryside into a hunting ground where Jewish families, resistance fighters, and anyone who dared to hide them became prey. But they never anticipated that their most sophisticated tracking system could be defeated by a little girl who paid attention to how her father's hunting dogs behaved after eating their grandmother's stew. Before the war turned her world into a nightmare, Marta lived the simple life of a farming family in the Carpathian foothills. Her father, Jan, worked a modest plot of land that had belonged to the Kowalski family for 4 generations, growing potatoes, cabbage, and rye while raising a few chickens and 2 hunting dogs. Her mother, Anya, maintained their small cottage, preserved food for the brutal winters, and taught Marta the old ways: which herbs could heal, which could harm, and which could do both depending on how you used them. The village of Wulbrom existed in that timeless space where seasons mattered more than politics, where the rhythm of planting and harvest defined life's boundaries. Marta attended the small village school, played with her younger brother in the fields, and learned to identify animal tracks in the forest alongside her father. Life was hard but predictable, governed by the ancient rules of rural Poland, where families survived through work, faith, and the unspoken agreement that neighbors helped neighbors when times got difficult. Then came September of 1939, and everything that defined normal ceased to exist. The German invasion swept across Poland like a mechanical plague, and within weeks, the Nazi occupation transformed Wulbrom from a quiet farming village into a cage. The SS established a command post in the town's former municipal building, and Capitan Friedrich Weber arrived with his unit and a pack of 6 meticulously trained German shepherds. These weren't pets or even normal guard dogs. They were tracking specialists, bred and conditioned specifically to hunt human beings through the dense Polish forests where partisan fighters and escaping Jews tried to disappear. Weber, a former police dog trainer from Munich, had spent years perfecting techniques to make his animals extensions of Nazi enforcement, capable of following a scent trail days old across rivers and through snowstorms. He publicly demonstrated their capabilities in the town square, showing how they could track a volunteer through 3 kilometers of forest in under 20 minutes. The occupation brought rules that made no sense to a child's mind, but were enforced with deadly seriousness. Jews from Wulbrom and surrounding villages were registered, marked, and gradually disappeared into trucks heading east. Neighbors began vanishing in the night, taken for suspicion of resistance activity or for the crime of having helped someone the Reich wanted dead. Jan Kowalski, like many Polish farmers, faced an impossible choice: watch innocent people die or risk his family by offering help. He chose the dangerous path, and the Kowalski cottage became a stop on an underground railroad that moved Jewish families toward uncertain safety. But every act of kindness created risk, and in occupied Poland, risk meant dogs, interrogations, and executions that Weber carried out with bureaucratic efficiency in the forest outside town. Marta understood her family was doing something dangerous long before she understood exactly what that meant. She noticed the false wall her father built in the barn, heard whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, and saw the fear in her mother's eyes when German patrols passed their farm. At 10 years old, she existed in that strange space between childhood and the forced maturity that war demands. Old enough to sense danger, but young enough to still believe that adults could protect her from it. She watched everything with the intense observation skills of a child who had grown up reading animal behavior and forest signs with her father. She noticed how the family's hunting dogs reacted to different foods, how certain smells made them sneeze and lose interest in tracking rabbits, how her grandmother's garlic-heavy cooking left the dogs confused and unwilling to follow even fresh scent trails around the property. In December of 1943, a Jewish man named David Rosenberg appeared at their door in the middle of a snowstorm, half frozen and desperate. He had escaped from a transport train heading to Auschwitz, jumped into a river to lose the dogs tracking him, and followed rumors that the Kowalski farm might offer shelter. Jan brought him into the barn's hidden space, knowing that Weber's dogs would eventually pick up the trail leading to their property. The family had perhaps 2 days before the SS arrived with their shepherds, and this time there would be no way to explain away the tracks in the snow, the scent trail leading directly to their barn, or the obvious signs that someone had taken shelter there. It was Marta, watching her father's hunting dogs completely ignore the area where her grandmother had just crushed garlic for dinner, who suddenly understood that she might know something the Nazis didn't. The morning after David arrived, Marta watched through the frosted kitchen window as her father paced nervously in the barn, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The fresh snow had stopped falling, which meant the tracks David left approaching their property would remain visible for days, a clear trail pointing directly to anyone who came looking. Jan knew the routine because he had seen it play out across the region. Weber would receive reports of the escape, deploy his tracking teams in a systematic grid pattern, and the dogs would follow the scent from the river to wherever it led. The Kowalski farm sat only 8 kilometers from where David had abandoned the train, well within the range the German shepherds could cover in a few hours of work. Every family in Wulbrom understood that hiding someone meant accepting a death sentence if discovered, and the SS had made examples of enough households that the message was brutally clear. Yet here was David, shivering in their barn, and here was Jan, unable to turn away a man whose only crime was being born Jewish in a world that had decided that warranted extermination. Marta had learned to read her father's moods the way she read weather patterns, and she recognized the particular tension in his shoulders that meant he was calculating impossible odds. Her mother Anya moved through the cottage with mechanical efficiency, preparing food that might need to last David days if they could figure out how to move him safely. The family's 2 hunting dogs, mixed breeds that Jan used for tracking rabbits and foxes, lounged near the fireplace, completely uninterested in the stranger in the barn. This itself was unusual, because the dogs typically alerted to any unfamiliar presence on the property. But they had spent the previous evening in the kitchen, while Anya prepared one of her grandmother's traditional recipes, a pungent stew heavy with crushed garlic, onions and herbs. The dogs had eaten scraps from the preparation, and now they seemed almost lethargic, their normally sharp noses apparently dulled. Marta had noticed this pattern before, but never connected it to anything useful, until the current crisis forced her young mind to make connections that desperation accelerates. The girl approached her father in the barn, where David sat wrapped in blankets, his feet showing early signs of frostbite from his time in the frozen river. She asked Jan a simple question about their hunting dogs, whether he had ever noticed how they acted strangely after grandmother's garlic recipes, how they seemed unable to track properly for a day or 2 afterward. Jan initially dismissed the observation as childish distraction from the serious adult problem at hand, but Marta persisted with the kind of stubborn logic that children employ when they know they have noticed something important. She reminded him of the time last spring when the dogs completely lost a fox trail right after eating garlic scraps, how they sneezed and pawed at their noses for hours. Jan stopped his pacing and looked at his daughter with sudden attention, his mind racing through the implications of what she was suggesting. The science behind Marta's observation was something neither she nor her father could have explained in technical terms, but it was fundamentally sound. Garlic contains allicin and other sulfur compounds that are powerfully aromatic and irritating to a dog's vastly more sensitive olfactory system. When consumed or encountered in high concentrations, these compounds can temporarily overwhelm a dog's scenting ability, causing irritation to the nasal passages and creating a confusing barrage of competing smells that makes tracking nearly impossible. The effect is not permanent, but it can last anywhere from several hours to a full day depending on the concentration and the individual animal. German shepherds trained for tracking are taught to follow specific human scent markers while ignoring environmental distractions, but their training never accounted for deliberate olfactory sabotage using something as common as crushed garlic. The Nazis had invested enormous resources into breeding and training their tracking dogs, creating what they believed was an infallible system for hunting humans through the Polish wilderness. But they had never imagined someone would think to fight back using kitchen ingredients. Jan realized that what his daughter was proposing was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. If they could saturate the approach to the barn with crushed garlic, create a scent barrier so overwhelming that the dogs couldn't distinguish David's trail from the general chaos of competing smells, they might buy enough time to move him safely. The plan relied on assumptions about animal behavior based on watching farm dogs react to cooking, hardly the foundation for betting 3 lives against the SS's most effective tracking system. But they had no other options, no weapons that could stop Weber's unit, no time to construct a more sophisticated hiding place, and no realistic chance of moving David in daylight without being spotted. The young girl's observation, born from the simple attention to detail that farming life teaches, had suddenly become their only strategy for survival. Troyston looked at Anya, who had been listening from the doorway, and saw in her eyes the same desperate calculation. Trust their daughter's insight or watch David die, and likely die alongside him when Weber's interrogators came. The decision to trust a 10-year-old's theory about garlic and tracking dogs was made in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that compressed moment when normal caution surrenders to desperate necessity. Jan sent Marta to their root cellar, with instructions to bring every bulb of garlic the family had stored for winter, while he explained the plan to David with the kind of quiet intensity that people use when discussing life and death in whispers. Anya began boiling water in their largest pots, preparing to create what they hoped would be an olfactory weapon against the Reich's most sophisticated hunters. The family had perhaps 12 hours before Weber's tracking teams would reach their area, based on the systematic search pattern the SS used, 12 hours to transform their property into something the German shepherds had never encountered. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on Jan. They were betting everything on the chance that a kitchen staple could defeat military technology, that folk wisdom about hunting dogs might outsmart Nazi training protocols. But in occupied Poland in 1943, absurdity had become the baseline condition of existence, and stranger gambles than this one had occasionally paid off. Marta worked alongside her parents with the focused determination of someone who understood that her observation had set events in motion and now carried responsibility for the outcome. She crushed garlic cloves using a heavy stone mortar, the pungent juice staining her small hands and filling the cottage with an overwhelming smell that made everyone's eyes water. The family processed nearly 40 bulbs, creating a paste so concentrated that handling it caused skin irritation and temporary numbness in the fingertips. Jan mixed the crushed garlic with melted animal fat and water, creating a slurry that could be spread across surfaces and would release its scent compounds slowly as it dried. The plan was to create multiple layers of olfactory confusion, saturate the area around the barn where David's scent trail was strongest, spread garlic mixture along the property boundaries to create false trails, and cover the actual hiding space with such an intense concentration that the dogs would physically recoil from investigating too closely. It was a strategy born from understanding how their own hunting dogs behaved, scaled up with the desperate hope that Wehrmacht-trained German shepherds would react similarly when confronted with sensory overload. As darkness fell on that December evening, the Kowalski family moved through their property like shadows, spreading their garlic weapon with the systematic coverage of people who understood they would get no second chance. Jan focused on the obvious approach routes, painting fence posts and trees with the mixture, creating a scent barrier that would hit the dogs long before they reached the barn itself. Marta, small enough to crawl into tight spaces, spread concentrated paste around the barn's foundation, and especially thick around the false wall that hid David. Anya created deliberate false trails leading away from the barn toward the forest, hoping to suggest that whoever had been on the property had continued moving rather than stopping to hide. They worked in silence, broken only by the crunch of snow under their boots and the occasional distant sound of dogs barking from neighboring farms, a reminder that Weber's teams were working their way systematically through the region. The winter night was brutally cold, well below freezing, which Jan hoped would actually help their plan by preserving the garlic's potency rather than allowing it to degrade. By midnight, the Kowalski property reeked so intensely of garlic that approaching within 50 meters made breathing uncomfortable, and eyes stream with involuntary tears. Their own hunting dogs had retreated to the far corner of the cottage, whimpering and pawing at their noses, refusing to go outside despite their normal eagerness to patrol the property at night. This reaction was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it suggested the concentration was sufficient to affect canine senses dramatically. Terrifying because, if the plan failed, they had created a giant olfactory beacon advertising that something unusual was happening at this particular farm. Jan sent his family to bed with instructions to act normally in the morning, to maintain their regular routine as much as possible, because any deviation from normal behavior would itself be suspicious. David remained hidden in the barn, armed with nothing but a small knife, and the fading hope that a child's observation about cooking and dogs might somehow be more powerful than the Third Reich's machinery of death. The next morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that follows fresh snowfall, the sun turning the landscape into a blinding white expanse that offered no cover and no mercy. Marta helped her mother with breakfast, forcing herself to eat bread and milk despite the nausea that fear produces in a child's stomach. Around mid-morning, they heard what they had been dreading, the distant sound of multiple dogs barking in coordination, the distinctive baying that tracking dogs make when they are working a scent trail. The sound grew steadily closer over the next hour, confirming what Jan had predicted. Weber's teams were following David's trail from the river, and that trail led directly to the Kowalski farm. The family watched from the cottage window as 3 SS soldiers appeared at the edge of their property, each controlling a German shepherd straining at its leash, the dogs pulling toward the barn with the confidence of animals that knew they had found what they were searching for. Captain Friedrich Weber walked behind his tracking teams with the casual confidence of a man who had never seen his dogs fail, his leather coat dusted with snow and his breath forming rhythmic clouds in the frozen air. He had been hunting escaped prisoners and resistance fighters through these forests for nearly 3 years, and his German shepherds had maintained a perfect record of finding whoever they were sent to track. The dogs had followed David's scent from the abandoned train car, across the frozen river where he had tried to lose them, and through 8 kilometers of forest with the mechanical precision that months of training produced. Weber knew the trail ended somewhere on this farm, because his lead dog, a 5-year-old male named Blitz, had begun the specific high-pitched barking that indicated close proximity to the target. The Capitan had seen this scenario play out dozens of times. The dogs would pinpoint the hiding location, his men would extract whoever was concealed there, and the farmer's family would be arrested for harboring enemies of the Reich. It was a routine so familiar that Weber was already mentally composing the report he would file that evening. But as the SS unit crossed onto the Kowalski property, something unprecedented began happening to the tracking dogs. Blitz, who had been pulling eagerly toward the barn moments earlier, suddenly stopped, planted his feet, and began sneezing violently. The other 2 dogs quickly exhibited similar behavior, shaking their heads and pawing at their noses as if trying to dislodge something painful from their nostrils. Weber's confidence wavered as he watched his perfectly trained animals begin to behave in ways he had never witnessed during years of field operations. The dogs were not simply distracted by competing scents, which sometimes happened in areas with heavy wildlife activity. They appeared to be in active discomfort, backing away from the direction they had been tracking, whimpering and refusing to advance despite commands from their handlers. One of the younger shepherds actually sat down in the snow and refused to move forward at all, something that would normally result in immediate retraining or retirement from tracking duty. Weber approached the barn himself, trying to understand what was disrupting his animals, and the overwhelming smell of garlic hit him like a physical force at about 20 meters distance. The entire area reeked with an intensity that immediately explained the dog's reaction, but raised far more disturbing questions. This was not the normal ambient smell of a family that used garlic in cooking. This was a deliberate, concentrated application of something the dogs found intolerable, spread across the property with obvious intentionality. The Capitan had encountered various attempts to throw off tracking dogs before. escapees would wade through streams, roll in animal dung, or try to mask their scent with pine branches. But he had never seen anyone deploy an olfactory countermeasure with this level of sophistication, creating a barrier so intense that the dogs could not physically force themselves to work through it. His military mind immediately understood the implications. Someone on this farm knew enough about canine tracking to sabotage it deliberately, which suggested either remarkable luck or previous experience with evading dog teams. The SS soldiers stood in confusion as their primary tactical asset became completely useless, the dogs continuing to sneeze and back away from the barn despite increasingly harsh commands from their handlers. Weber made the decision to search the property manually, ordering his men to check every building, while he personally questioned Jan Kowalski about the suspicious concentration of garlic. Jan, who had been preparing for this moment since the previous evening, met Weber at the cottage door with the practiced deference of a Polish farmer who understood the cost of appearing anything other than cooperative and slightly simple. He explained in broken German that his wife had been preparing preserved garlic for trade with other families, a common practice in rural Poland where food preservation meant survival through the brutal winters. He gestured toward the pots in the cottage where Anya had deliberately left evidence of garlic processing, the story prepared to explain exactly what Weber's nose was telling him. The lie was simple, barely plausible, but backed by physical evidence and delivered with the kind of resigned exhaustion that occupiers had come to expect from occupied populations. Weber did not believe the farmer's explanation, but he faced a tactical problem that training had not prepared him to solve. His dogs were useless in their current state, sneezing and refusing to approach the areas where they should be searching most intensely. He could order a manual search of the barn, tear apart every wall and floorboard, and possibly find whatever the dogs had been tracking, but the property was not large. His men could see no obvious evidence of recent construction or hiding places, and a thorough search would take hours in sub-zero temperatures, while other escaped prisoners were moving further away from capture. The Capitan stood in the Kowalski farmyard, furious at being outmaneuvered by what appeared to be either incredible coincidence or unexpected cleverness, weighing whether to commit resources to a search that might find nothing or to move his teams to areas where the dogs could actually function. Weber made the pragmatic calculation that officers in the field learn to make. Cut losses, move to the next target, and file a report noting the anomaly. He ordered his men back to their vehicles, shooting Jan a look that promised future attention, but for now accepting that this particular hunt had been compromised by circumstances he could not immediately overcome. The sound of German vehicles departing down the frozen road was the sweetest music the Kowalski family had ever heard, but Jan would not allow anyone to celebrate or even relax until the engines had faded completely into the distance, and an hour of silence had confirmed the SS was truly gone. Marta stood at the window watching the tire tracks disappear around the bend, her small hands still stained yellow from crushing garlic, trying to process what had just happened. A 10-year-old girl's observation about how cooking smells affected farm dogs had just defeated the Third Reich's most reliable hunting system, turned away trained SS soldiers, and saved a man's life. The enormity of it was too large for her child's mind to fully grasp, but she understood enough to know that the knowledge now living in her head had suddenly become more valuable and more dangerous than any weapon her father could have hidden in the barn. Weber had left without finding David, but he had also left with questions and suspicions that would not simply disappear, and the Kowalski farm was now marked in ways that made future resistance work exponentially more dangerous. Jan waited until full darkness before approaching the barn to tell David that he had survived the day but could not stay beyond tonight. The risk calculus had fundamentally changed. Weber would file reports, other SS officers would learn about the incident, and the garlic trick would lose effectiveness the moment it became known. The Kowalski family had bought David one day of life, but continuing to shelter him would now bring scrutiny they could not survive. Jan made contact with other resistance members through carefully coded conversations at the village market, arranging for David to be moved to a different safe house 15 kilometers away, a farm where Weber's teams had already searched and moved on. The Jewish man left the next night, moving through the forest with a small supply of food and a pouch of crushed garlic that Jan insisted he carry, though both men understood the trick would never work the same way twice. David clasped Jan's hand in the darkness, trying to find words adequate to thank a family that had risked everything for a stranger, but Jan simply told him to survive and remember, because memory would be the only justice many victims of this war would ever receive. Word of what happened at the Kowalski farm spread through the underground resistance network, with the speed that useful information travels when survival depends on sharing knowledge. Other families hiding Jewish escapees or resistance fighters began experimenting with garlic and other strong-smelling substances, creating variations on Marta's accidental discovery. The technique was never as effective as that first deployment because Weber circulated warnings to other SS units about deliberate scent contamination, and handlers began training dogs to work through olfactory distractions. But for a brief window in the winter of 1943 through early 1944, crushing garlic became a small act of resistance that saved dozens of lives across occupied Poland. Families would deploy it when they heard dogs approaching, buying precious hours to move people or destroy evidence. The Nazis adapted by conducting more manual searches and relying less exclusively on canine tracking in areas where garlic use had been reported, which ironically made their operations slower and less efficient, allowing more people to slip through the gaps in their enforcement network. Marta's life returned to the careful routine of appearing normal under occupation, attending the village school where German officers now supervised the curriculum, helping her mother with endless household tasks, and watching everything with the sharpened awareness that comes from understanding how much difference small observations can make. She never spoke about what she had done, not even to her younger brother who was too young to keep dangerous secrets, and she learned to carry the weight of knowing that her actions had placed her family in Weber's mental file of farms requiring future attention. The Capitan did return to the Kowalski property twice more over the following months, conducting surprise inspections that found nothing because Jan had ceased all resistance activities that directly involved their farm. Weber never forgot the smell of that concentrated garlic barrier or the sight of his perfect tracking dogs rendered completely useless by a simple kitchen ingredient, and the professional humiliation of being outsmarted drove him to become more methodical and more brutal in his subsequent operations across the region. The war ground on with its relentless machinery of death, turning seasons and years into a blur of occupation, resistance, and survival. The Kowalski family endured through a combination of caution, luck, and the kind of resilience that Polish farming families had developed through centuries of foreign occupations. Marta grew from a child into a young woman while the Reich collapsed around her, watching Soviet forces push through Poland in 1944, witnessing the chaos of retreating German units, and eventually experiencing the complicated liberation that came when one occupation simply replaced another. Through all of it, she carried the memory of that December morning when she had watched Weber's dog sneeze and retreat, when a child's simple observation had proven more powerful than military training and sophisticated breeding programs. The knowledge that intelligence and attention to small details could sometimes overcome overwhelming force became a foundation stone in how she understood the world, a lesson learned at 10 years old that would shape the rest of her life. The winter of 1944 brought a subtle shift in the dynamics of occupation as the German military position deteriorated across the Eastern Front and resources that had once been abundant became increasingly scarce. Weber's unit received fewer supplies, less fuel for vehicles, and directives from command that prioritized immediate military threats over the systematic hunting of escaped prisoners and hidden Jews. The Capitan himself became more erratic and dangerous as professional frustration mounted, conducting raids with increasing brutality as if violence could compensate for the strategic collapse happening across Poland. The incident at the Kowalski farm had become something of a legend among SS tracking units, whispered about as both a cautionary tale and a source of dark humor. The day a Polish farming family outsmarted the Reich's best dogs with kitchen ingredients. For Weber, personally, the memory festered like an infected wound, a professional humiliation that he could not reconcile with his self-image as an expert in canine tracking operations. He kept the Kowalski name in his records, waiting for any excuse to return and conduct the kind of thorough interrogation that usually ended with entire families disappearing. Marta watched the war's progression through the lens of village life, where grand strategic movements translated into small daily changes. Fewer German patrols, more desperate requisitions of food and supplies, whispered rumors of Soviet advances that adults discussed in careful code. The village school closed intermittently as teachers disappeared or fled, leaving Marta's formal education fragmented and incomplete. She spent more time helping on the farm, learning from her mother the extensive knowledge of herbs, preservation techniques, and practical chemistry that rural Polish women passed down through generations. These lessons were not framed as resistance training or tactical preparation, but as simple survival skills necessary for enduring winters and food shortages. Yet Marta understood, with the premature wisdom that war forces on children, that knowledge itself was a form of power, that understanding how things worked in the natural world could be weaponized when circumstances demanded it. She began experimenting quietly with other strong-smelling plants and substances, testing how they affected the family's hunting dogs, building a mental catalogue of information she hoped she would never need to use again. The spring of 1944 brought news that traveled faster than German censors could suppress it. The Soviets were approaching from the east, the Reich was in full retreat across Poland, and the occupation that had seemed permanent was beginning to fracture. Villages across the region existed in a strange liminal space between occupiers, experiencing both hope and terror, as they understood that transitions of power are often the most dangerous moments for civilians caught in the middle. Weber's unit received orders to withdraw westward, abandoning the systematic persecution operations that had defined their presence in favor of defending against Soviet advances. The Capitan made one final visit to the Kowalski farm before his unit pulled out, arriving without warning on a morning in early May when spring mud had replaced winter snow and the world smelled of thawing earth rather than frozen death. He brought no dogs this time, just 2 soldiers and a list of questions about partisan activity in the area, delivered with the cold professionalism of a man who knew he was running out of time to settle old scores. Jan met Weber in the farmyard, with the same careful deference he had maintained throughout the occupation, answering questions about neighbors and resistance movements with the practiced vagueness of someone who understood that the wrong word could still get his family killed, despite the Reich's collapsing position. Weber walked through the property one final time, examining the barn where he remained convinced someone had been hidden that winter day, searching for evidence that his professional instincts about this family had been correct. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. David Rosenberg had long since moved through the underground network and was now somewhere in the chaos of Eastern Europe, one of thousands trying to survive until the war's conclusion. The Capitan stood in the exact spot where his dogs had refused to advance months earlier, the memory of that concentrated garlic barrier still vivid in his mind, and he looked at Marta with an intensity that suggested he understood more than he could prove. The girl met his gaze with the blank expression that Polish children had learned to adopt around German officers, showing nothing of the intelligence or awareness that lived behind her eyes, giving Weber no satisfaction beyond his own suspicions. Weber departed that morning knowing he would never return to Wulbrom, that the Reich's presence in this region was ending, and that whatever had happened at this farm would remain an unsolved mystery that would bother him for years to come. The SS unit withdrew westward over the following weeks, joining the chaotic retreat of German forces across Poland as Soviet armies pushed forward. Captain Friedrich Weber survived the war, returned to Germany, and spent the rest of his life working with police dogs in Munich, never again achieving the perfect operational record he had maintained, before a 10-year-old Polish girl discovered that crushed garlic could defeat his most sophisticated tracking systems. He would sometimes tell the story to other dog handlers, always framing it as an anomaly and never admitting the deeper truth, that he had been comprehensively outsmarted by people he had been trained to consider inferior, that all his expertise and training had been rendered useless by folk knowledge and desperate improvisation. The Soviet liberation of Wulbrom in July of 1944 was less a moment of triumph and more a exchange of one set of occupiers for another. Though the immediate threat of racial extermination ended and Jewish survivors began the agonizing process of discovering how few of their family members had made it through alive. David Rosenberg was among those who returned to the region that autumn, having survived multiple close calls and hidden locations before the Soviet advance finally made movement slightly less deadly. He came back to the Kowalski farm on a cool October morning, thinner than Jan remembered, aged far beyond the few months that had passed, carrying the hollow expression that survivors wore when they were still processing the magnitude of what they had endured. David brought no grand gestures of thanks, no dramatic pronouncements about the debt he owed, just a quiet afternoon sitting with the family, sharing what little news he had gathered about other families who had tried to hide, other resistance networks that had succeeded or failed. He asked to meet Marta specifically, to speak with the child whose observation had saved his life, and when they finally sat together, he struggled to find words appropriate for thanking a girl who was now 11 for having the presence of mind to notice something about dogs and garlic that trained soldiers had never considered. Marta listened to David's stories of survival with the same quiet attention she brought to everything, absorbing details about other hiding places, other narrow escapes, building a mental map of how the resistance network had functioned across the region. She asked him practical questions that surprised the adults, whether anyone else had tried using strong smells to confuse tracking dogs, whether the technique had worked in other locations, whether the Germans had developed counter-tactics. David confirmed what the underground network had already learned. The garlic trick had been effective for a brief window, but lost power once the SS units understood what was happening and adapted their search protocols. The innovation's greatest value had not been as a repeatable tactic, but as a psychological weapon that introduced doubt into what had been the Reich's most reliable hunting system. Once officers like Weber learned that their dogs could be deliberately compromised, they began second-guessing negative searches and conducting more time-consuming manual inspections, which created exactly the kind of inefficiency that allowed gaps in enforcement through which lives could slip to temporary safety. The conversation between the child and the survivor touched on something profound about resistance under occupation. That effective opposition rarely looked like the dramatic acts portrayed in propaganda or later in heroic retellings. Real resistance was often small, improvisational, and built on whatever knowledge or resources people had immediate access to. Marta had not planned to become part of the resistance movement, had not undergone training or made conscious decisions about risking her life for political ideals. She had simply noticed something about how dogs reacted to garlic, mentioned it at a desperate moment, and inadvertently created a small tactical advantage that rippled outward through networks of people trying to save lives with inadequate tools and impossible odds. David told her that dozens of families had deployed variations on her discovery, that the technique had bought time for people to move or hide evidence, that children and grandchildren existed because someone had gained a few extra hours to escape a search. He could not quantify exactly how many lives the observation had touched, but he wanted her to understand that her willingness to speak up, to share what she had noticed even when adults might have dismissed it as childish irrelevance, had mattered in ways that extended far beyond their single encounter. The meeting ended with David departing once again, this time heading west toward displaced persons camps, and the long bureaucratic nightmare of trying to emigrate somewhere that might offer actual safety rather than merely the absence of immediate extermination. He left the Kowalski family a small bag of silver coins, pre-war Polish currency that had some residual value, and a promise that if he survived to build a new life somewhere, he would find a way to tell their story. Marta watched him walk down the road toward an uncertain future, understanding that she might never know what ultimately happened to the man whose life had intersected with hers for less than 48 hours, but whose survival had become permanently woven into her family's history. The girl returned to the rhythms of farm life under Soviet occupation, navigating new rules and new dangers, while carrying the private knowledge that small observations could have large consequences, that paying attention to the world around her was not merely curiosity but potentially a survival skill, survival. The years immediately following the war were brutal in different ways than the occupation had been, with Soviet control bringing its own forms of repression, food shortages that rivaled anything experienced under the Germans, and the slow grinding process of rebuilding a shattered country under a political system that trusted no one. Jan Kowalski was questioned multiple times by Soviet authorities about his activities during the war. The new occupiers as suspicious of resistance networks as the old ones had been, though for different ideological reasons. The family learned to navigate this new reality with the same careful attention to danger that had kept them alive under the Reich, understanding that the fundamental rules of occupied life remained consistent regardless of which foreign power was currently in control. Marta grew into her teenage years in this environment, her education continuing in fits and starts as the Polish school system was rebuilt according to Soviet models, her practical knowledge of farming and survival far exceeding any formal academic training she received. By 1947, when Marta was 14, the full scope of the Holocaust's devastation had become undeniable, even as Soviet authorities tried to frame the narrative exclusively around fascist aggression rather than acknowledging the specific targeting of Jewish populations. The girl who had once crushed garlic to save a single life now understood that David Rosenberg represented one of perhaps only 3,000 Polish Jews who survived out of the 3 million who had lived in Poland before the war, a 99% extermination rate that defied comprehension. She learned these statistics not from official sources, but from whispered conversations, from the empty homes in Wulbrom that would never again hear the families who had occupied them, from the devastating absence that hung over every village and town across Poland. The garlic trick that had seemed so clever in December of 1943 now felt almost absurdly small against the industrial scale of murder that had been operating across the occupied territories. Yet Marta also understood that dismissing small acts of resistance because they could not stop the larger machinery of genocide was itself a form of surrender to the Reich's posthumous victory. The true moment of reckoning came not from statistics or official histories, but from a letter that arrived at the Kowalski farm in the spring of 1948, forwarded through multiple intermediaries and bearing stamps from the American occupation zone in Germany. David Rosenberg had survived, had made it through the displaced persons camps, and was emigrating to the United States with a small group of other Polish Jewish survivors. The letter was brief and carefully worded to avoid attracting Soviet censors' attention, but it contained information that hit Marta with unexpected force. David had reconnected with other survivors who had been hidden by the same underground network, and through comparing stories they had identified at least 17 separate instances where families had used concentrated garlic to disrupt SS tracking dogs between December 1943 and March 1944. 17 times that people could specifically document, which suggested the actual number was higher, given how many rescue attempts left no records or survivors to tell the story. David's letter included names when he had them, brief descriptions of families who had deployed the technique, and his personal belief that Marta's observation had directly contributed to saving somewhere between 40 and 60 lives across the Carpathian region during those critical months. The numbers were impossible to verify with certainty, lost in the chaos of war and occupation, but they transformed how Marta understood her own history. She had spent years thinking of the garlic incident as a single desperate improvisation, her family's private story of surviving one terrifying day. The letter revealed that her insight had propagated through resistance networks, had been adapted and deployed by other desperate families, had become a small piece of tactical knowledge that people used to buy precious hours of survival. 40 to 60 lives saved was a number large enough to represent entire extended families, children who grew up, marriages that happened, futures that existed because someone had gained enough time to move a hidden person before the dogs arrived. Yet it was also a number small enough to comprehend as individual human beings rather than abstract statistics, which made the weight of it both more bearable and more profound. Marta sat in the farmhouse that evening, reading and rereading David's letter, trying to reconcile the quiet child she remembered being with the idea that her observation had rippled outward to touch dozens of lives she would never meet. The letter also contained a darker revelation that David felt obligated to share. The technique's spread had eventually contributed to escalated brutality from SS units who, frustrated by their dogs' unreliability, had begun conducting more aggressive manual searches and more punitive actions against families suspected of hiding people. Weber's unit and others had adapted by essentially assuming that any property with intense garlic odors was deliberately masking something, leading to violent interrogations and executions that might not have occurred if the dogs had simply been allowed to search normally and find nothing. David did not frame this as Marta's fault, or suggest she bore responsibility for Nazi violence, but he wanted her to understand the complete picture, that resistance actions create reactions, that tactical innovations force adversaries to adapt, and that nothing in war happens without complex and often tragic consequences, rippling outward in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled. Some families had been saved by the garlic technique, others had potentially been endangered by the heightened suspicion it created. Both realities existed simultaneously, and both deserved acknowledgement. Marta absorbed this information with the kind of maturity that teenagers are capable of, when life has forced them to think seriously about moral complexity from a young age. She understood that David was giving her the respect of honesty rather than comfortable simplifications, sharing the full picture rather than reducing her role to simple heroism. The girl who had crushed garlic at age 10 had acted from desperation and limited understanding, deploying whatever tool was available without the luxury of considering long-term strategic implications. The 14-year-old reading David's letter had enough perspective to understand that her actions had existed in a context of impossible choices where every decision carried risks and unintended consequences. She wrote back to David, a letter that took multiple drafts before she felt it captured what she needed to say, that she was grateful he had survived, that knowing the technique had helped others mattered to her, and that she understood resistance was complicated and messy rather than clean and heroic. She asked him to share her family's regards with any other survivors he encountered, and to remember that the Kowalski farm remained a place where people had tried to act according to conscience rather than fear, even when the outcomes were uncertain and the costs were high. The exchange of letters between Marta and David continued sporadically over the following years, limited by the difficulties of corresponding across the Iron Curtain and the fact that Soviet authorities monitored international mail with paranoid intensity. David eventually settled in New York City, found work as a bookkeeper, married another survivor, and began the slow process of building a life after trauma that never fully heals but becomes something you learn to carry. His letters to Marta shifted from recounting war experiences to describing his attempts at normal existence, the strange displacement of living in safety after years of mortal danger, the survivor's guilt that came from being alive when so many others were not. He told her about other resistance stories he had heard from the survivor community, acts of courage and desperation that ranged from elaborate rescue operations involving dozens of people to single individuals who made split-second decisions that saved one life at immense personal cost. The common thread through all these stories was improvisation under impossible pressure, people using whatever knowledge, skills, or resources they possessed to resist a system designed to make resistance fatal. David wanted Marta to understand that what she had done fit into a larger pattern of ordinary people, finding extraordinary applications for ordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Marta's own life moved forward along paths that would have seemed impossible to imagine during the war years. She completed her education under the Soviet system, showing particular aptitude for chemistry and biology, subjects where her natural observational skills and her childhood spent learning about plants and their properties gave her advantages. She eventually attended university in Krakow, one of the few young women from rural backgrounds who made it to higher education in the early 1950s, studying agricultural chemistry with a focus on natural compounds and their practical applications. Her professors never knew that her interest in how organic substances affected animal behavior stemmed from crushing garlic to defeat Nazi tracking dogs at age 10. But that foundational experience shaped her entire approach to science. The understanding that theoretical knowledge mattered most when it could be translated into practical action, that folk wisdom often contained sophisticated understanding waiting to be formalized, and that small interventions at the right moment could produce disproportionate effects. In 1956, when Marta was 23 and working as a research assistant at an agricultural institute, she received what would be David's final letter. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer, likely caused by the months he had spent hiding in damp, poorly ventilated spaces during the war, breathing mold spores and chemical fumes that had slowly destroyed his respiratory system. The cancer was advanced and treatment options were limited, but David wrote with remarkable clarity about what he wanted to say before the opportunity passed. He told Marta that he had been thinking about the garlic incident for 13 years, about the chain of small decisions and observations that had led to his survival, and he had reached a conclusion he wanted to share: that her greatest contribution had not been the tactical trick itself, but the willingness to speak up as a child when adults were making desperate calculations. The world trains children to defer to adult authority and accept that they lack relevant knowledge. But Marta had trusted her own observations enough to interrupt her father's crisis planning with information she believed was important. That intellectual courage, that refusal to self-censor based on age or status, was the real lesson David thought should be preserved from their story. The letter continued with David's reflection on how survival during the Holocaust often came down to seemingly trivial factors: being in the right place by chance, knowing someone who knew someone, having a skill the Germans needed, or benefiting from a single moment when the machinery of extermination failed to operate perfectly. He had lived because a little girl paid attention to how cooking affected dogs, because her father was willing to trust her observation, because garlic happened to be in season, and because Weber had made a practical calculation about deploying resources efficiently. Any one of those factors changing would have meant his death, and the same was true for every survivor. Their continued existence depended on chains of circumstances so fragile that examining them too closely induced vertigo. David wanted Marta to know that he did not see his survival as evidence of divine intervention or cosmic justice, but as the product of human choices made under extreme pressure, and that her family's choice to act according to conscience rather than safety had been the crucial link in his particular chain of unlikely survival. David Rosenberg died in January of 1957, and news of his death reached Marta through channels that took months to navigate the bureaucratic barriers between the United States and Soviet-controlled Poland. She learned that his funeral had been attended by dozens of people from the survivor community, that he had requested his story be included in the testimonial archives that Jewish organizations were compiling to document resistance and rescue during the Holocaust, and that he had specifically asked that the Kowalski family be mentioned by name as people who had risked everything to shelter a stranger. Marta attended a small memorial service at the synagogue in Krakow, one of the few that had reopened after the war, and listened to a rabbi read excerpts from David's testimony about his time in hiding. Hearing her family's story told as part of the historical record, preserved for future generations to study and remember, gave Marta a strange sense of displacement. The terrifying experience she had lived through at age 10 was already becoming history, interpreted and framed by people who had not been there, transformed from lived reality into documented fact. Marta Kowalski lived to be 87 years old, dying peacefully in 2020 in Krakow, her life spanning from the interwar Polish Republic through Nazi occupation, Soviet control, the Solidarity movement, and finally an independent Poland that her 10-year-old self could never have imagined possible. She never became famous, never wrote memoirs or gave dramatic interviews about her wartime experiences, preferring instead a quiet life dedicated to agricultural research and teaching university students about the chemical properties of plants. But in her final years, as Holocaust memory became increasingly urgent with the passing of the survivor generation, she agreed to record her testimony for the historical archives, sitting in front of cameras to describe the December morning when she crushed garlic to save David Rosenberg's life. The interviewers wanted dramatic details and heroic pronouncements, but Marta spoke with the precision of a scientist describing an experiment, the observations that led to her insight, the practical application of folk knowledge, the uncertainty about whether it would work, and the profound relief when Weber's dogs retreated in confusion. She insisted the story be told accurately rather than sentimentally, that future generations understand resistance as improvisation by frightened people using inadequate tools rather than as grand gestures by fearless heroes. What haunted Marta most in her final years was not the trauma of what had happened, but the mathematical horror of what had been lost. For every David Rosenberg who survived because someone deployed crushed garlic, or forged papers, or hid them in a barn, there were hundreds who died because the garlic was moldy, the papers were detected, the hiding place was discovered. For every clever trick that worked, there were dozens that failed, and the difference between survival and death often came down to factors too random to feel like justice. Marta had spent 7 decades thinking about the 40 to 60 lives that her observation might have saved, but she also thought about the 3 million Polish Jews who were murdered, about the families in Wolbrom who had no one to help them or whose helpers were caught before the war ended. The weight of those numbers never diminished, and she rejected any interpretation of her story that suggested cleverness or courage could reliably defeat industrial genocide. The garlic trick had worked once, had been adapted and used a few dozen times, and then had been overcome by Nazi adaptation. It represented a tiny crack in a vast machinery of death, important to the individuals who slipped through it, but ultimately unable to stop or even significantly slow the broader extermination program. Yet Marta also came to believe, especially after reading decades of testimony from other survivors and rescuers, that small acts of resistance mattered precisely because they were not sufficient to stop the Holocaust. The Third Reich had devoted enormous resources to creating systems of total control, to making resistance appear futile, to convincing both perpetrators and victims that the machinery of genocide was inevitable and unstoppable. Every time someone found a way to throw a wrench into that machinery, even temporarily, even on a small scale, it demonstrated that the Nazi system was not omnipotent, that improvisation and human ingenuity could sometimes overcome superior force and organization. The psychological importance of this resistance extended beyond the immediate lives saved. It provided evidence that ordinary people retained agency even under totalitarian occupation, that conscience and compassion still existed alongside the horrors, and that the story of World War II was not simply a narrative of victims and perpetrators, but included a third category of people who refused to accept the binary choice between collaboration and passive acceptance. The question that Marta posed to her students and to anyone who heard her story was profoundly uncomfortable. What would you have done? It is easy to imagine ourselves as heroes when we read about history from positions of safety and comfort, easy to condemn those who collaborated or remained silent, easy to celebrate those who resisted. But Marta insisted that her students confront the reality that resistance meant risking not just their own lives, but their children's lives, their parents' lives, the lives of everyone connected to them. The Kowalski family had been fortunate that the garlic trick worked, and that Weber made the tactical decision to move on rather than conduct an exhaustive search. If either factor had gone differently, Marta's 10-year-old self would have watched her parents shot in their own farmyard, would likely have died alongside them, and the story would have been one more anonymous atrocity among millions. She asked her students to sit with that knowledge, that doing the right thing under occupation meant accepting the high probability of torture and death. That moral courage in such circumstances came at costs most people in free societies never have to contemplate. The question was not meant to excuse those who collaborated or to diminish those who resisted, but to force genuine engagement with the impossible moral arithmetic of living under totalitarian rule. Marta's final message, recorded in her last interview before illness made speaking difficult, was directed specifically at future generations who would never experience occupation but would face their own moral tests in different forms. She spoke directly to the camera, her voice steady despite her age. The lesson of the garlic story was not that cleverness defeats evil or that small acts of resistance are sufficient to stop genocide. The lesson was that you use whatever tools you have, whatever knowledge you possess, whatever opportunities present themselves, and you act according to conscience even when the odds are terrible and the costs are high. You pay attention to the world around you because observation might reveal something useful. You speak up even when you are young or powerless because your perspective might contain information others lack. You resist when resistance is possible, and you survive when survival is the only option available. You remember the dead and honor them by refusing to let their stories disappear into statistics. And most importantly, You reject the seductive lie that ordinary people cannot make a difference against overwhelming power, because accepting that lie is how totalitarian systems win, even after they have been militarily defeated. The garlic trick worked once because a 10-year-old girl noticed something about dogs, trusted her observation enough to share it, and had a father willing to bet everything on a child's insight. That combination of attention, courage, and trust is not a tactic specific to resisting the Third Reich. It is a fundamental human capacity that remains relevant whenever power seeks to make resistance appear impossible.